Hello, everyone. Today I have here a very, very special guest, Alexander Mercuries. He is a London-based international affair analyst with focus on Russia and American foreign policy. And he's the commentator of the channel The Duran, available on YouTube and Odyssey. The channel has been covering on a daily basis almost all the details of the conflict in Ukraine, including with the participation of uh, journalists in loco. And the links will be available below. Alexander, I'm delighted to have you here, and thank you so much for accepting DCM's invitation for this interview. Thank
And
you.
I'm delighted to be with you, and it's a great pleasure and a great honor.
Thank you, Alexander. So I think Brazilian audience should hear what you have to say. We have been also plagued by misinformation. So our main TV channels are painting a picture which might not be totally the whole story, are choosing facts in order to deliver a balanced view, which is far from balanced and uh, contaminated by Russiophobic comments. So it's very important for you to be here, someone who really understands the situation and is not commenting on Ukraine since February, but a lifelong. So, Alex, now I started to ask you. I want to talk to you a bit about the military reality and the political goals um, in this war. So, the New York Times say that Russian struggles in its attempt to take Kiev. This was today, and that Russia is resorting to long-term missiles. The Guardian today say that in Mariupol, Ukrainian forces continue to repulse Russian attempts to occupy the city, and that Ukrainian forces claim to have retaken the town of Marikiev. But according to the maps of these media outlets, it shows a bit of a different picture of Russian armies actually progressively advancing. Um, but the UN secretary today just declared that Russia cannot win this war. So at the same time, the conflict is clearly concentrated in the Donbas region, as you have mentioned before, in which but we have very few reports on what's going on in the Donbass. So I would like to start by asking you, what can we tell about the military realities on the ground at this stage? And what can we say about the Russian strategy and whether the military and political objectives of Russia are being met?
Right. I think the first thing to say, and I have to always say this, is obviously I'm not a military person, so I've had to rely a lot on people who are. And of course, obviously, I have access to information sometimes from Russian sources and other sources. Now, my own understanding of this is that the main focus of the battle, the major war, is going on in Donbass. This is where most of the Ukrainian army is concentrated. And the Russian military objective is to encircle and eventually destroy that Ukrainian army. And all the indications that I'm getting, all the information that I'm getting, is that the Russians are incrementally and steadily achieving that objective, that Ukrainian army in Donbass, which is, as I said, far and away the most important part of the Ukrainian armed forces, is, if not fully encircled, at least largely encircled, that he's finding it extremely difficult to maneuver, that the Russians are steadily acquiring territory around it, and they're also in the process of capturing key places like the town of Mariupol, which you mentioned. Now, Mariupol, we got a report from the Russians today that half the city is now under their control. I have no way, obviously, of saying whether that or not that is true, but it would be consistent with the information we've been getting up to this point. And Mariupol's fall will, in turn, release more Russian troops and Russian allied troops from these two republics to complete that encirclement of the Ukrainian army. Now, further west, the Russians have positioned significant forces around Kiev, and they've also encircled some other important Ukrainian towns like Kharkov, Chernigov, Sumy, and the rest. But they have made no attempt up to this point to actually seize these cities. And I think the reason they are doing that is because obviously they don't want to get dragged down in street fighting, but also because it's not part of their primary objective, which is to destroy that Ukrainian army in the Donbass. I think what they're doing is that they're keeping their troops close to these big cities because that forces Ukraine to disperse its forces. So they have to have troops around Kiev, preventing them from reinforcing their troops in Donbass. And at the same time, of course, when the major force of the Ukrainian army in Donbass eventually collapses, then of course that means that the Russians are already close to Kiev and places like this and can start to apply considerable force against the Ukrainian government in these places. Now, that's my analysis. It's also the analysis I know of several other people. It was also touched upon recently. The Financial Times in London published a long piece a couple of days ago, which basically said the same thing, that this was the Russian approach to this war. And I think that is what is happening, that incrementally, steadily, step by step, they are coming ever closer to achieving their main objective, which is the destruction of the Ukrainian army in the east.
So what you're saying is that the Russian objectives are not actually the appropriation, territory appropriation, like getting the main cities, if I understand you correctly.
Mm.
So that's why maybe Kiev has been, yeah, is not yet the focus, but to destroy the armies and maybe to assure Donbass. Will that be correct?
That is exactly correct. It's also, by the way, for what it's worth, consistent with what the Russians said from the very first moment that they started their operation. They said that their operation was not to occupy territory, it was not to attack civilian areas, it was to demilitarize and, as they say, denazify Ukraine and to protect the Donbass. So demilitarizing Ukraine means destroying its armed forces. Denazifying Ukraine is something we will come to later. It's perhaps a more ambitious part of their strategy, but suffice to say for the moment that most of the very hardline, ultra radical Ukrainian military formations, which the Russians describe as Nazi formations, are also concentrated in the east as part of this grouping of forces that they're encircling. And thirdly, of course, focusing on the Donbass and destroying the Ukrainian army there is consistent with protecting the Donbass. So I think that is the Russian military strategy. I think one of the reasons we don't understand it very well in the West is because we fight wars in a different way. We tend to take cities, we tend to seek to overthrow the governments of particular countries. We do not actually make the major focus the destruction of armies. So if I can just give two examples, when the United States went to war with Afghanistan after 2001, they didn't set out to destroy the Taliban forces in the countryside. They carried out a bombing campaign, and then they sent people to take Kabul. And then they did exactly the same when they invaded Iraq. They did a bombing campaign. They sent the army straight into Baghdad. They overthrew the government there. But the result was that the armed men who made up first the Taliban and then the Iraqi army were left with their arms. They dispersed across the countryside and they
Back.
were able to go back. Exactly. And and the war then dragged on, as we know, in both countries for years and years, and it's turned out disastrously badly for the Americans. Whereas the Russians, who have a more, in some ways, traditional approach to war, their major focus always is the destruction of the enemy's army and therefore the enemy's ability to continue fighting. So it's a difference in military philosophy. And I think it's not one that many people in the West fully understand.
You mentioned Clausewitz, that he is one that
Yeah.
thinks it's about deterring the ability to defend rather than occupying, right?
That is exactly correct. And it is important to say that in the Russian General Staff academies, as I happen to know, they do teach Clausewitz. And
Mm.
partly, by the way, that is because, of course, the Russian General Staff is the inheritor of the traditions of the Soviet General Staff. The Soviet General Staff was constructed around concepts of Clausewitz, partly because people like Friedrich Engels were extremely impressed by Clausewitz. But anyway, it's also perhaps important to remember that Clausewitz himself, for a large part of his military career, was a Russian officer serving in the Tsar's armies during the Napoleonic War. So it's arguable also that, Clausewitz's ideas, which is that you break the enemy's ability to continue fighting by destroying his army, that Clausewitz may have borrowed some of these ideas from the Russians originally. So, there may be a lot of cross thinking. But anyway, this is Clausewitzian strategy, very different from the type that we follow in the West.
Alexander, I wanted to touch upon a bit about the sanctions that have been imposed by Russia.
Mm,
In other words, about the economic warfare
mm, mm,
launched to Russians. So, the European Union imported 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia in 2021, which is almost half, 45% of its gas imports, and nearly 40% of the total of the amount used.
mm,
According to the International Energy Agency, Russia is among one of the top 5 trade partners of the EU, responsible for 6% of the import. China
mm.
22, by the way, according to the European Union statistics sites in 2020. So it seems inevitable that those sanctions will come to bite the European Union, or at least to have a notable effect in the European economy. Um, so it's just an echo. I'm just muting temporarily. So what can you tell us about a potential backlash on Europe's economy? Considering this is unavoidable, why is the EU shooting its own feet in a war they say they are not part of? Why they are willing to take such a sacrifice upon themselves? What do you think is Europe aiming by arming Ukraine and joining this economic warfare against Russia?
I'm going to make a guess because you're making some extremely valid points about European policy, which in a rational sense is not really very easy to understand because
Yes.
clearly clearly what we are doing in Europe, and Europe is part of the world economy. It will affect every part of the world economy, but it will affect Europe especially badly. But what we are doing in Europe is definitely going to provoke a recession. I was just reading just before we did this program that there is now a major diesel shortage across Europe. Diesel is, of course, what commercial vehicles use. So, we're going to have problems moving supplies around. We're going to have any number of problems. And of course, yes, Russia is 6% of what we of our trade, but it's part of that 6% accounts for certain very important things like natural gas, like oil, like food products, like all sorts of things. So why have we done this? I'm going to make two guesses. Firstly, I think that there has clearly been in Europe over a very, very long time now, probably going back before the Ukrainian crisis, a growing sense of disillusionment and anger that Russia has not become the kind of economic partner, the kind of they haven't established the kind of relationship with the Europeans that many people in Europe expected after the end of the Cold War, and that the Russians don't seem to understand, if you like, that they lost the Cold War, and that they should be following in a way our interests and not coming back and pushing back on us. And I think a lot of these decisions we have seen were decisions made in anger, which were not thought through properly. And this then brings me to my second reason. And it is that I also think that along with this, there is very little understanding or knowledge of Russia itself. So I think when they unrolled all of these sanctions, there was an assumption that very rapidly, possibly within days or weeks, there would be a massive economic financial collapse in Russia that would cause the government there to lose control of the situation. It might provoke the people, the business leaders, who Western Europeans always call the oligarchs, who they assume are the people who pull the levers in Moscow, the political levers, that they would either force Putin to back down or even remove him from power. And I think what they're now discovering is that it isn't like that, that the Russian economy is actually a lot more resilient and diversified than they realized, that the financial crisis in Russia, which they expected, hasn't actually happened. And yes, Russia will experience a recession, but it will undoubtedly come through it. And that they have not been able to change the political system in Russia in the way they anticipated. So, where I think this was a shock and awe strategy, the idea of knock out Russia fast, destabilize Putin's government, break its financial system. What they've now discovered, what they're now starting to discover, is that they're there for for a long battle of economic attrition, which they're not really prepared for. And there's just been an EU Council meeting where the hardliners were saying, well, let's actually step this up. Let's now cut ourselves off from Russian energy supplies, especially oil. And other countries were having to push back because they said, well, we can't do that. There isn't just enough oil around. We're facing a diesel shortage. We're going to face more shortages. So you are already starting to see arguments and divisions starting to float up to the surface. And I suspect that this is a consequence of the Europeans finding themselves in a position which 3 weeks ago they didn't think they would be in. By the way, just on the subject of sanctions, I saw an article today in another British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which says that the sanctions on Russia have already failed. And that was quite an interesting admission.
What exactly did they say? Because I
Well,
mean, you mentioned that it
mm,
was quite of a bold move to freeze the assets, the billions, I think 160 or 300 million billions in
mm,
Russian assets. That probably the financial market did not like it. If you
no.
could expand that on that too, but please, I would.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, this article, which is by an economist, a rather eccentric economist, but sometimes very brilliant, called Ambrose Evans Pritchard. Strange name, but there we go. England does go in for double-barreled names. But Ambrose Evans Pritchard discusses all of this, and he discusses this business of going after the Russian central bank. Now, that was the really important sanctions. I
Mhm.
mean, disconnecting some of the banks was serious from the SWIFT messaging system. But the actual freezing of the central bank's reserves, that's $640 billion is the total reserves. The amount that's been frozen is believed to be somewhere around $340 billion. It's a huge amount of money. And also sanctioning the central bank so that it means that Western financial institutions, banks, companies, traders, foreign currency traders, are no longer allowed to have any contact with it. This was an incredibly radical step. And it was expected that what it would do, it would prevent the central bank from taking action to support the ruble, the Russian currency. It was assumed the ruble would crash. Some people were saying it would fall to 170, 200, $300 a ruble, a dollars to a ruble, ruble to a dollar. I mean, it would essentially, Russia would be looking at a hyperinflation situation. Banks would start to collapse, and the country would start to default on its foreign debt. Well, none of that has happened. What has happened is that the Russian central bank imposed capital controls. It moved very quickly to stabilize the financial system within Russia itself, and that is now functioning normally. But most important of all, or perhaps most indicative of all, is that it turns out that the Federal Reserve Board in the United States, which was not apparently consulted about the sanctions against the Russian central bank has said that Russia must be allowed to continue to pay its foreign debts. So what is happening is that the Russian government, when debts fall due to be paid, sends instructions to American Western banks, which hold all these Russian funds, which have now been frozen. They give payment instructions, and these Western banks honor those instructions despite the sanctions. They obviously have to get permission to do it, but they are doing it. Now, the reason is that the Federal Reserve Board apparently said if we don't let this happen, if there is that kind of Russian default, it could have implications for the entire global financial system. And therefore, because we can't allow risks like that to the global financial system, we have to allow the Russians to continue to pay their debts. So already the sanctions against the central bank have been watered down, at least for the time being. And in the meantime, because energy prices, worldwide energy prices have risen, the Russians continue to receive a very large stream of funding. Some people put it as high as $750 billion a day from their energy exports, which is enough for them to keep their economy still functioning. So we see, well, the financial part of their economy, their export economy, still functioning, and it provides them with enough funds to enable the ruble to be traded at a steady rate in the global markets. So Ambrose Evans Pritchard says that the sanctions in the end were half-hearted because they didn't go against the energy exports for the reasons we know. That would have created an even bigger crisis in the West, but that the result is that they've created for the West the worst of all possible worlds. The Russian economy still continues to function. It's not put under the kind of pressure where it might be forced to discontinue the war. That's what he says. But in the meantime, the sanctions are such that they've already caused effect on the Western economies, which as a result are facing an inflation crisis and are probably going to go into recession. So that's his analysis of the situation. I agree with parts of it. I think that he understates actually the damage to the Western economies if we actually did impose this across the board embargo on Russian energy sales. I think we would find ourselves in an even worse position, a far worse position than he expects. And I think the Russian economy actually would still be able to keep functioning, even if all energy exports were cut off.
And let's say all those exports that Russia was giving to the European Union, this 122 billion, certainly China cannot get it all of it, right? And
Yeah.
it's one it wouldn't be a market either. But
Mm.
can Russia send this to other partners? Is the European Union can be substitute in the short term?
Well, not in the short term. I mean, to be very clear, Russia is going to go through at least a year's of recession, and I mean, probably quite a severe recession. But eventually, yes, of course they can. They can supply quite a lot of gas to China, not perhaps quite as much as they did to the European Union, but it'll be enough to maintain a steady cash flow. They've already developed liquefied natural gas projects in the Arctic, so they can start selling more of that gas to other Asian countries. And they're now busy forging agreements with countries like India to sell oil to India. So yes, they can maintain a substantial amount of energy exports um, to various places around the world. Perhaps it will cause a reduction in their total energy exports, but not to the extent I think that it would be existential. And bear something in mind, even though a lot of this energy is going to be sold by the Russians at a discount, it will be sold at a discount against extremely high energy
Right.
prices. So it'll still mean that they're probably getting more money for their oil and their gas than they were a few years ago when prices were much lower, even if they're are selling lower export volumes and doing so at a discount.
It's very interesting because what you just said about the economists, it seems there a bit of a change of heart from the economists. Because I just had a recent
Mm,
report here where they say, ever since Russia seized Crimea in 2014, Western sanctions have failed to act as a credible deterrent against Russian aggression. But that new measures targeting Russia's financial system announced by America will change that. So apparently, The Economist has changed its own assessment.
yeah.
It looks like.
Well, indeed. I mean, there's a famous thing, that if something fails, you just try it again and again and again and again, in the expectation that it will succeed. And
Completely.
somebody said that that's actually a good definition of insanity. Do what fails and just go on doing it. I mean, sanctions are not policies that generally succeed in forcing governments to change and expecting that a country like Russia, which is, I mean, to say it straightforwardly, self-sufficient in food and self-sufficient in energy. It has enough, in other words, to keep going, and it's got a fairly substantial industry, and it's got economic partners around the world, that it's going to crack under sanctions pressure. I think that is, frankly, again, a sign of some people not perhaps understanding fully how complex the world is today and how things don't quite work in quite the way that they used to. If we were having this conversation in the year 2000, when the United States and Western Europe and the West dominated the world economy entirely, in fact, to a great extent, they were the world economy, well, then it would have been different. But today, things are not quite like that. And I think a lot of people in Europe and in the United States, more, I should say, in Europe than in the United States, have not fully understood this.
It will be hard. It will require a therapist, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk to you now about the extent and the foreign intervention in Ukraine. By that,
Mm,
I mean, for instance, in 2014, we watched the US
mm,
and neo-Nazi backed coup in Ukraine, where you have audio tapes from Victoria Nuland and
mm,
Pierre discussing who will be the president of the Ukraine, where we have them inside, which was called Maidan. And we also saw the Azov battalion being legalized and incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard
mm,
and being given police powers. But not only that, this force have been very active in the Donbass region,
mm,
explicitly stating that they want an ethical cleansing of the Russian-speaking population, subhuman, Untermenschen,
mm, mm,
and that's where the foreign intervention becomes a problem, because there have been numerous reports about foreign support and training of the neo-Nazis battalions and militias by different governments. And but we still have people on the progressive side
mm,
minimizing those facts,
mm,
questioning whether they are Nazis and question whether they have any level of influence in the government or in the state structure. So, what can you say about the nature of those Azov battalions, and the level of interference in the
mm,
governmental policies that they have in Ukraine,
yeah.
and the attacks in Donbas region, and the level of influence, international influence in
Yeah.
Ukraine? So it's a
Uh,
large question.
it's a large question, but can I just say, I mean, I'm by origin Greek, and of course, I'm talking to somebody who is from Latin America, from Brazil. So the fact that Western powers can sometimes operate and work with people with extreme right and neo-Nazi views is not something which in Greece or in Brazil or in Latin America we find particularly difficult to understand. In Europe, and it's much more difficult, I think, for the populations to really believe that such a thing can happen, that their governments can, in fact, work hand in hand with neo-Nazis and ultra-right groups. And that's, I think, one of the problems, because, of course, the United States media, the European media, they still dominate to an extraordinary degree the information space. They don't like to talk about Azov, which is, to be straightforward about it, a National Socialist, a Nazi grouping. And it's not the only one in Ukraine. There are others as well. There's the Idar battalion, which is very similar in its ideological beliefs. There's also, of course, some others. I mean, there's an organization called the Donbass Battalion, which is apparently only mildly less extreme than this. But they do exist in Ukraine. They're a significant force in Ukraine. They are heavily embedded in the political structures within Ukraine. They are part of the National Guard, which is a part of the Ukrainian military. They make no secret of their ideological and political beliefs and their objectives, which are exactly as you said. And of course, the events of 2014, the change of government that took place there, a change of government which I would call a coup, but of course others call it
It is
other
a coup.
things.
It is a coup. I
But it
don't
is a
think it
coup.
can be
I think it is a coup.
disputed.
I would unhesitatingly call it
Well,
a
if
coup.
you have Nazis coming to the parliament at gunpoint, I don't
It's a
think I
it's
find
a
it
coup.
troubling
It's a
not to
coup.
call it a coup. Yeah.
It's a coup. It's a coup. And of course, it was Western supported, and it brought these people into the positions of power which they still have in Ukraine today. And of course, if you are looking at this from a perspective in Washington that you want to detach, you want to break Ukraine away from Russia, distance it as far as possible, make it hostile to Russia, who are you going to rely upon in Ukraine to follow that strategy? People of sort of left of center liberal views in Ukraine are not reliable in that respect, because they might make common cause with Russia for all kinds of reasons, because there's a left in Russia as there is in everywhere. I mean, it's a misconception that it doesn't exist. So you can be sure that Nazis in Ukraine are politically reliable people if you have that kind of project of detaching Ukraine from Russia. So you actually choose to support them, and you choose to train them, which is to a great extent actually happened, and you choose to embed them in the political structures and indeed the security structures, the SBU, which is the in, essentially the secret police in Ukraine, and in all of those sort of layers. Now, in the Greece that I can remember in the 60s, that was very prevalent. We had exactly the same setup in Greece. We had neo-Nazi groups. We had, supported by the West, by the United States, infiltrated into the security services, into the army. They may not have been a large proportion of the population, but they were politically powerful. And I think in Latin America, you have that to a much greater degree and a much more violent degree than we ever had in Greece. If you think about Ukraine in that kind of context, then I think it becomes much more understandable. And I think that people on the left in Europe and the United States who are in denial about this, one can understand why they might be, because, as I said, it's still a very difficult concept for them to accept that the West actually chooses to get into bed politically with Nazis. But I think people in South America with lots of experience can understand it much better.
The issue we have in South America is, or at least in Brazil, I cannot speak for South America, but in Brazil, is that our foreign policy analysts tend to be a repercussion box of the international analysis. And I have seen people on the left in Brazil saying, well, we have Nazis everywhere, even in Ukraine. And I think it's quite different when you have them as part of the state, not even the government, but the state, when you legalize them, give them state power with swastikas, with Wolfsangel, schwarze Zone, to go and kill people. I find it very difficult to see the equivalence in that. I don't know if you agree with me.
I think this is exactly correct. This is exactly, I mean, obviously there are Nazis in most countries. I don't say every country, but in many countries you will find people with these very disturbing and terrible views. But It's not the same as when they are embedded in the security and military structures. In Ukraine, they are. I mean, they have been deliberately placed there. That is why organizations like the Azov Battalion, and these people make no secret of this. I mean, they all carry tattoos, for example, which make their political beliefs absolutely obvious and completely clear. A unit like the Azov Battalion functions as part of the National Guard, the Ukrainian National Guard, which is a part of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, that is an extraordinary and very dangerous and very disturbing thing. And of course, anybody who knows about Nazis knows that if they get their hands on the levers of state power, then of course they very quickly take the whole state over to a very great extent and determine its policies. So saying that these are, every country has its Nazis, that may be true, but not in every country do you have the Nazis actually, to a great extent, in control. In Ukraine, you do, and they've got guns, and they're part of the military, and they are able to go out and they kill people. And if, just to give you examples, there were reports about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that one of the negotiators in the Ukrainian delegation that negotiates with the Russians, that he was assassinated. It's still very uncertain upon what ground, why he was killed, but the suspicion has to be that he was killed because something he did wasn't satisfactory to these sort of very violent and very dangerous people.
We wonder if Zelensky can even uh, go into an agreement. If how could I mean they would have to have control of those forces. It's also a question that arises. Are they hijacking Zelensky and make it more difficult an agreement?
Well, what we know about is that there was, when after he was elected, and of course he was elected as the peace candidate, he actually tried to meet with some of these people in order to try to persuade them to accept, to allow him to pursue a policy of negotiation with the Donbass. And they told him, and I understand it, there's actually film of this. They said, if you do that, we'll leave you hanging on Kreshchatik, which is the main street in Kiev. And I believe this is all on film. So I mean, I think this is extremely difficult. It is extremely difficult for him to do this. And if we come back to the topic of denazification, which is what the Russians were talking about when they started this war, I think one of the things that they've been floating is that, they say to themselves, well, how do we negotiate with the Ukrainians? Perhaps we can negotiate with Zelensky himself, but in order to do that, we have to denazify Ukraine. We have to destroy these groups. So at that point, maybe he can finally do the deal that he wants to do with us. Now, I think that the Russians are becoming increasingly disillusioned with Zelensky, and it may be that even that isn't possible. But anyway, I think that was part of their original thinking when they sent their troops into Ukraine. That unless these forces are destroyed in Ukraine, a peace in Ukraine is impossible, and a negotiated agreement with the Ukrainian government is impossible as well.
So detaching Zelensky from those forces would
Yes.
be probably a condition sine qua non for this agreement to happen.
Absolutely. If it is going to be Zelensky himself who will agree to it, and I mean, Zelensky, one has to say this, is not an experienced political leader. He doesn't have an enormous base of support in Ukraine. So one of the difficulties I think the Russians are now discovering is that he says one thing one day and says something completely different the other, and that it may not actually be the negotiating partner that they perhaps hoped he might be. But that's something we'll have to see how it evolves over the next few weeks.
That's exactly what I want to talk to you about in the next part of the interview. But I just want to share with you an experience that I had. I went to the Ukrainian embassy to try to find volunteers that are being recruited to see where would be the take and expectations in being a volunteer. And I was sent by the embassy to a civil center, like a culture center from Ukraine, and there I interview one off camera and on camera a person who presented himself as one of a supportive Euro maiden in London, one of,
Okay.
and he talked like a Nazi. He
Mm,
talked about in genetical terms, in
mm, mm,
value and racial superiority. And I was very, it surprised me to see that a cultural center like Alliance Française, you would find such a close link between the Euromaidan and the Nazi argument. What can we say about the Euromaidan and the links to the Nazi? Because it felt to us that apparently was in the beginning a legitimate movement by legitimate people.
yeah. I've always been a lot more skeptical about this. I mean, I've long heard the view that Euromaidan at the start was, all sorts of liberal, pro-Western people, and that they, protested because they wanted a closer association with the European Union, but they, looked the other way as all these very hardline Nazi people turned up. I have to say this, I find that very difficult to understand. I think, especially in a city like Kiev, which, remember, experienced Nazi occupation and the Holocaust and all those horrors. I think that to say that liberal people look the other way when Nazis are around them, calls into question whether they can be liberal at all. To say it straightforwardly, I've always been much more suspicious about Euromaidan. I think that right from the outset, it was a far right thing. And I think that the Western governments who supported it were perfectly well aware of that, and were perfectly well aware of the kind of people who were involved in it.
So I want to talk to you about the probabilities of an agreement now.
Mm,
So Zelensky declarations are very contradictory,
mm,
to
mm,
say the least, and it's very difficult to identify his aims. If it seems
mm,
pretty volatile or at least unclear. Less than a week ago, he seemed to have accepted the neutrality of Ukraine and to be willing to close the peace agreement. For him, a day later, to withdraw the offer. Then he
mm,
continues to talk about escalating the war, go to the US Senate and the British Parliament to request an immediate no-fly zone, military air force support from other
mm,
countries, and the enhancement of economic warfare on Russia. And yesterday he said that an agreement with Russia will have to be ratified by a referendum. And the Russian terms of agreements seem not to move at all, which will
mm,
be Crimea as recognized as the Russian territory, the recognition of the independence of the both Republic in Donbass, and neutrality of the Ukraine. What do you think is hindering this agreement? Is the control that neo-Nazis or the West might hold over Zelensky, or is Zelensky, what would be the motivations of Zelensky to continue the war? Although it seems that his country could be destroyed, he could have a
yeah.
lot of casualties and of civilians, of 18-year-old young men
Mhm,
who are being
mhm,
forced to fight. Um,
yeah.
and and it's yeah. So I'd like to know
Yeah.
what is hindering this agreement.
Well, indeed, because of course, as you absolutely rightly said, various times at various points that Zelensky has spoken, he seems to have conceded, in principle, all the points that the Russians are demanding of him. And then, of course, when it comes down to it and there's a negotiation, it turns out that he doesn't quite mean what he says, and things get pulled back. I think that there are contradictory forces within Ukraine pulling him in different directions. I think that Zelensky himself finds it very difficult to decide what he wants to do. And I think we must also accept that he's under enormous stress himself. And as I said, he's inexperienced. And I don't think he really has a clear understanding of what's happening around him. But I think there are probably some people who are telling him, look, we are facing absolute disaster, the collapse of Ukraine. Let's try and do a deal with the Russians. These proposals, these demands they're making, yes, they're difficult for us, but they still leave us with a country, and we can find a way forward. But I think others, the Nazis that we said, who are still there and who are still very, they're certainly there in Kiev, the security forces, the SBU, the secret police, if you like, they would not want any kind of compromise, because, of course, that kind of compromise would leave them exposed in whatever Ukraine was left to possible cleansing up, retaliatory action, things that they will not want to see happen to themselves. And on top of that, there is the other factor that one also gets the sense that he's getting a lot of advice, bad advice, from Western leaders. I mean, there was this strange cavalcade of East European leaders, the Polish, Slovak, and Slovene and Czech prime ministers went to Kiev. And I thought it was very interesting that they went to see him, to Zelensky, at exactly the moment when he seemed to be moving towards agreeing to some kind of neutrality. And I think some Western leaders, and this is very much the view in Moscow, by the way, would like to see the war continue to the last Ukrainian, because they would much rather have the war prolonged, hope that it will provoke some kind of crisis in Russia, and they don't want to see a situation where the eastward expansion of NATO is essentially stopped, because that might in time lead to suggestions that perhaps, as part of a general settlement of the security situation in Europe, we could start to see changes done to the security architecture in Eastern Europe, like a pullback of NATO forces, which, of course, these particular people don't want. These particular East Europeans don't want, and which people in London and some people in Washington don't want either. So you have this very complicated push-pull situation with Zelensky. I personally think that the Russians have almost given up expectations that they can do a deal with him. And a couple of days ago, the main Ukrainian opposition leader, who was a man called Viktor Medvedchuk, escaped house arrest. It's possible that he did that with the help of the Russians. I don't know, but it seems plausible that
That's
he
very
did that.
interesting.
And of course, the very next day, Zelensky announced that 11 political parties in Ukraine had been banned, including Medvedchuk's party, which is the main opposition party, and that there would be an attempt to control the media space by concentrating all television and radio in basically one government-controlled channel. Now, I can't help but wonder whether that was a response to Medvedchuk's disappearance and is a sign that Zelensky is worried that an alternative government might be eventually created, and that government might be the one ultimately that signs the agreement with the Russians. Now, I'm obviously speculating here. I don't know these
Yeah.
for a fact, but it seems to me a plausible reconstruction of events.
And this would also fit in with the aim of a forever war, the typical neocon war that Washington has been perpetrating since 2001 and September 11. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this aim to extend the war and avoid a settlement that may put the Western forces in maybe a dishonored position in their view. I don't know. Alexander, I don't know if you still have time for one more question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you let me know when you need to go, because I have so many questions. So once what I
One more. Yeah, one more
okay.
question.
So I also would like to. Some people say that Ukraine is Ukraine is not a de facto NATO member. Yet a lot of people argue that due to the level of foreign influence and military structure, Ukraine is de facto, well, he's not formally, but it's de facto a member of the NATO. And but I want to hook on that something else. Consider many people, even on the progressive left, would tends to see a fight between two empires in expansion. The Russian empire trying to expand itself, and the American or the Western empire trying to expand themselves. Well, we know the Ukrainian crisis did not begin in February 2022, but follows directly from the post-Cold War pressure to expand the NATO, the continuous foreign interferences on the change of government in the regions, the systematic withdrawal of the USA from arms control agreements. And it was not something unknown to Washington and Pentagon, that they were fully aware and warned that those type of operations would provoke probably an intervention by Russians. This was the words of Jack Matlock, the ex-ambassador of the USA in the Soviet Union, back in 2000. In 1997 in the Senate. And William Burns, the current director of CIA, went even farther when he was ambassador of Moscow. He said Russia eventually will have to make a decision whether to intervene, a decision that Russia does not want to make. This was revealed by WikiLeaks on an email correspondence. So, and among all the other high-level officials, they tend to recognize a legitimate sovereignty concern of Russian being ignored. Some progressives dismiss this argument, saying this is a realistic approach and that Russian sovereign interest, it was not threatened, but just its zone of influence. Qualifying this dispute between two empires. Do you agree with that? Do you think are
No,
two empires fighting,
no.
or just Russian has a concern which is legitimate?
I think the Russians have a fully legitimate concern. Now, I wanted to also say, however, that one mustn't romanticize Russia or the Russians. It is a great power, not a power comparable to the United States, but it is still a great power. It's got armed forces, it's got intelligence services. I'm sure the Russians do all sorts of things which one would not necessarily approve of. I don't want to make them appear better than they are, but the fact is that NATO has been expanded relentlessly right up to their borders. And it's been expanded in a way that makes it absolutely clear that Russia is ultimately the target. When the Russians asked at various times, are we in a position, will you let us join NATO? They were told no. And this has come, of course, following a history in the 1990s when the Western powers, the United States especially, tried to micromanage Russian domestic policy and did so very, very much in their interests. So the Russians see this, they see the question of Ukraine as an existential issue. They don't, I think, have any desire to get themselves involved in a war. They were certainly not looking for territory. They made proposals, repeated proposals, which they made again last December in the form of 2 draft treaties. They said, what we want you to do is to agree not to expand NATO eastward further, not to take in Ukraine, and to take your military structures out of Eastern Europe, which you'd originally told us that you would never put them there. And had those proposals been accepted, I am fairly confident that we would not have had a war. Now, those are not the kind of proposals that an expansionist empire makes. They are not overtly aggressive proposals. They are proposals that address concerns, and I think real concerns about security. Now, when Westerners say that NATO is not a danger to Russia, I think, again, you have to look at what NATO has done. I mean, NATO has been involved in wars in Afghanistan, in Libya. NATO member states were very heavily involved in the wars in Iraq and in Syria. The Russians, Yugoslavia, which is a major event for the Russians, and of course was one of the events that led to a political crisis, which was responsible for bringing Putin to the presidency, a fact which Westerners tend to discount. And within Russia itself, the Russians themselves claim, and this has never been formally contradicted, that the insurgencies in the Caucasus in the 2000s, in the 1990s and the 2000s also received support from the West. So the Russians look at NATO, they look at the West, they look at the way, the kind of rhetoric about them that they hear coming from the West. They see all the sort of constant pressure that they feel themselves to be under. They remember the fact that there were promises given to them way back in the 1990s, early 1990s, when the Soviet Union still existed, that NATO would not move eastward. And you come along and you tell them, well, NATO is not a threat to you. Of course, they don't believe it. I mean, it'd be astonishing if they believed it. And when they see NATO becoming involved in Ukraine and training Nazi movements there, Nazi battalions there, which are extremely anti-Russian, and as you correctly say, want a ethnically purified Ukraine with all Russian speakers driven out. Well, again, when the Russians see that, trying to persuade them that NATO is not a threat to them is impossible. And frankly, I agree with them. I think that in this instance, NATO manifestly is a threat to them.
Alexander, I want to know whether you have your final thoughts to the Brazilian audience. If you want to invite them to join, feel free to say
Yeah.
whatever you haven't
Well,
mentioned yet that you'd like to.
well, I would say first of all that obviously I'm very grateful to Sarah for this opportunity to address a Brazilian audience. If you're interested in my analysis and the analysis that I do, and I usually available pretty much every day, I try to keep a commentary going on this crisis. You can find me on YouTube at the Duran, and you can also find me on my own channel, which is Alexander Mercurius, a more complicated name, but you'll find the links under the under Sarah's under this video. And also, can I also say that I think that this is a global crisis. It's not one just confined to Europe. It has global implications, so it's important. And I think that given the history in South America, of which Brazil no doubt is a part, though obviously a very huge and distinctive part, I think South Americans, Brazilians, have perhaps a better ability to understand it than people maybe in Europe do. And that applies to people on the left in Brazil as well, especially them, perhaps.
Yes, Alexander, I think we know all too well for all too
Mm,
long
mm,
about the coup d'etat the United States had promoted in our continents. My parents
mm,
had friends that had been hijacked and thrown into an airplane to die at the age of 20 something.
mm,
And not, and we have,
yeah,
I was born within the dictatorship still. So I think this should be very, I hope this is very present on other people's mind. And now we have the talks of Colombia trying to join NATO, which actually means NATO, NATO being in South America. Not, it's the opposite. And we have the Amazonia, and I think it is probably a potential territory of expansion. I feel this war is very close to us. And
excellent.
I would like to thank you very, very much. You have a very busy channel, over 100,000 viewers, that you made the time to talk to us. Thank you very much, and we all hope that this war is soon over as soon as possible, and that the Ukrainian, the Russian people are safe in the war of the masters. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah.